First of all, I have one question for everyone. The question is this. Do you have a memorable place? Do you have a memorable place? For me, whenever I am struggling with my troubles, I like to visit this place. And I went here last 2 weeks ago to Seoul Forest Park. Especially, there is one specific bench I already shared before. In the bench, it said, "Come to me." So when I sat there, I felt comfort. And recently, I was struggling with financial issue, so I was worried about my life. However, when I visit this place and when I prayed to God while I was sitting on there, God comforted me once again. Yes, I tried to seek the Lord once again. I was thirsting for God in my circumstance. So I have one question. How about you in your life? Are you thirsty for God in your circumstance? Especially today, we can find one person who decided to seek the Lord, who decided to thirst for God in his circumstance. So let us meditate on his prayer and God through our passage today. So let us read Psalm chapter 42 and verse 1 more time. Ready, go. As your deer pants for a flowing stream, so pants my soul for you, O God. To begin with, let us find out the background of the passage today. Especially David, he was struggling with his circumstance. Unfortunately, he had to hide himself from his enemies who tried to accuse him. Therefore, he had to leave and escape from Jerusalem in order to save his life. For example, let us read Psalm chapter 42 and verse 3. Ready, go. My tears have been my food day and night, while they said to me all the day long, "Where is your God?" Likewise, David, he cried a lot because of his pain. In other words, he was struggling with his troubles. Even his tears became his food. Therefore, he was in darkness without hope. He was hopeless. Nevertheless, David did not give up his life, or rather, he decided to depend on God through his prayer. He decided to depend on God through his prayer. Especially, we can find the prayer through our passage today. So what is a prayer? Let us read Psalm chapter 42 and verse 1 one more time. Ready, go. As a deer pants for a flowing stream, so pants my soul for you, O God. Especially, he used the comparison in his prayer. Can you say together? Comparison. So what is the comparison? Yes, he used a deer as his comparison. To be specific, he compared himself with a deer. He compared himself with a deer. Especially he explained his circumstance the same as the deer. For example, as a deer thirsts for streams of water, David also thirsts for God. To be specific, the deer panted for water when they were thirsty. Therefore, the water sustained the life of the deer. The water sustained the life of the deer. The deer only need water to fulfill their thirst. So the water became the source of life for the deer. Source of life. Yes, the deer, they could not live without the water. Therefore, when David used the word pant, he used heavy term aram it is not just simple thirst, but rather it refers to a desperate need for something. Can you say it together? Desperate need for something. In other words, as a deer desperately needed water, David also desperately needed God in his troubles. It was his desire for expression. Especially the prophet Joel, he also mentioned the purpose of the plant. For example, let us read the book of Joel chapter 1 and verse 20, ready go. Even the beasts of the field pant for you, because the water brooks are dry up, and fire had devoured the pasture of the wilderness. At that time, the beasts also panted the water because of the drought. The land became barren desert. That's why the beasts also need water to fulfill their thirst. In the same way, as the deer pants for the water, David also thirsts for God in his circumstance. That's why David used the deer as the comparison in his circumstance. In other words, David only needed God in his troubles. Especially, we should remember God once again. So who is God? Let us read Psalm chapter 42 and verse 2. Ready, go. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My soul thirsts for the living God. Yes, God is the living God. Can you say it together? Living God. One more time. Living God. Especially David wanted to compare God with other pagan gods, like idols. To be specific, there was no life in other pagan gods, other idols. However, God is the living God who is still working. There is a life in the name of God. Therefore, David used Hebrew term Elohim when he called God. Especially the name of God, Elohim, it refers to God's power. Also, when people use Hebrew term Elohim, it was only used for the personal relationship with God. In the same way, David only trusted in the living God who had the power through his prayer. In other words, David did not stop praying to God in order to keep his personal relationship with God, Elohim. Can you say it together? Elohim. Also, we can find an example of the living God, example of Elohim in Old Testament. For example, let us read book of Joshua chapter 3 and verse 10. Ready, go. And Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Habitants, the Perizzites, and Kenizzites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. At that time, Joshua, he encouraged the Israelites who were fearful, since the living God will defeat other enemies through his power. Yes, this is the same living God as when David prayed in the Psalm today. Likewise, David trusted in God's power in his troubles. In other words, David was assured that God will save and rescue him from his troubles. Furthermore, we can find one of his desires in his prayer. There is one thing in his prayer. So what is one thing? Let us read verse 2 one more time. Ready, go. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? When shall I come and appear before God? Likewise, Likewise, David was longing to come and appear before God. In other words, he was longing for the temple of God in Jerusalem. To be specific, at that time, people used to worship God at the temple in Jerusalem. However, David was not able to come to the temple of God because of his suffering. That's why David, he was eager to worship God at the temple of God in Jerusalem. For example, let us read Psalm chapter 27 and verse 4. Ready, go. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire his temple. Likewise, David was longing for worship at the temple of God in Jerusalem. It was his desire. In other words, David thirsted for God in his circumstance. David wanted to continue to have a personal relationship with God. That's why he compared himself with the deer, as a deer wanted to long for the water in the passage today. So today, we meditate on the prayer. Yes, David only trusts in God through his prayer. However, this prayer did not end the essence. It teaches us to live as Christian. First of all, thirst for God. Can you say it together?
Thirst for
One
God.
more time.
Thirst for God.
As a deer and David thirst for God, we should also thirsty for God in our circumstance. In other words, we only need and seek God. Also, when David was thirsty for God, he does not need the physical need as a deer did, but he also thirsts for God spiritually. Especially, you can find an example of spiritual thirst in the ministry of Jesus. For example, let us read Book of John chapter 4 and verse 10. Ready, go. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who is it that is sent to you, give me a drink. You will have asked him, and he will have given you living water." At that time, Jesus fulfilled the woman who was thirsty for both physical and spiritually. Especially the water refers to the living water, which was Jesus. Likewise, Jesus was the only one who could satisfy her life. Likewise, David also needed God who could satisfy him. In other words, he wanted to continue to have communion with God. He wanted to continue to have personal relationship with God. In the same way, we should also thirst for God as David did. Especially as we participate in Holy Communion today, we should continue to spend time with God. We should continue to have communion with God. We should remember Jesus who still loves us. Therefore, God will fulfill our thirst in our lives. So we should always ask this question ourselves, are we thirsty for God? For example, Donald Whitney, a pastor, he mentioned the purpose of God. He said that, can we read it together? Ready, go. God creates a thirst for himself so that he can satisfy it with himself. Likewise, he encouraged believers to thirst for God, since God is the only one who can fulfill their needs. That's why David also decided to thirst for God in his troubles. Also, when we thirst for God, we should always remember God once again. So who is God? Yes, it is the living God. In other words, God still works through his power in our lives. Especially, God is the living God who still hears our prayers. God is the living God who still hears our prayers. For example, I want to share my story with you. Do you remember that I shared about the rainbow message last month, right? So at that time, I showed the rainbow picture, which was my sister took in Canada. So I remember God's promises. However, I also wanted to see the rainbow once again. Especially, I am having a financial issue and I was struggling with my troubles. Therefore, I asked God to show the sign of the rainbow once again to trust His promises. And by God's grace, God heard my little prayer and God showed me the rainbow once again last Thursday. It was a double rainbow. So I shared with you last Thursday, right? Likewise, God has a power to show His rainbow once again to me. Also, God hears my prayers as well. The reason I share my story is because God also wants us to thirst for God once again. Yes, God hears all our prayers. Therefore, we only need to thirst for God once again through prayer. Especially, we can also find one of God's attributes. Can you say together, God is omnipotent? Ready, go? God is omnipotent. Yes, God is all powerful. That's why David decided to seek God, who is Elohim as well. Also, David, he continued to trust God once again. For example, let us read Psalm chapter 42 and verse 11. Ready, go? Why are you cast down, my soul? And why are you turmoil with me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise Him, my salvation and my God. Likewise, David decided to continue to put his hope in God, who had the power to save him. Therefore, he did not fear anymore, or rather, he satisfied in God. In the same way, when he thirsts for God, we should continue to trust God, who is our salvation. Therefore, let us continue to thirst for God in every season of our lives. Thirst for God. And secondly, we are blessed. Can you say it together?
We are
One more
blessed.
time. We are blessed. Especially, there is one benefit when we are thirsty for God. There is one benefit. So what is the benefit? Especially Jesus mentioned in his Sermon on the Mount in his ministry. For example, let us read book of Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. Ready, go. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. At that time, Jesus encouraged believers to thirst for righteousness. Especially, the word righteousness refers to God's holiness and obedience. Can you say it together? God's holiness and obedience. In other words, Jesus encouraged believers to continue to seek God's holiness and obey His words by faith. Obey His words by faith in order to live as righteousness. Therefore, when they thirst for righteousness, God will bless their lives. That's why believers will be blessed as well. Especially, it was the same God which David thirsts for God in the passage today. Therefore, as we continue to thirst for God, we will be blessed as well. God will continue to bless our lives when we thirst for God. In the same way, when we continue to thirst for God, God will see us as blessed. Yes, God will continue to bless our life through His blessing. So can you say to your neighbor, God bless you? Can you say together? God bless. One more time. God bless you. Especially We can find an example of God's blessing in Old Testament. For example, let us read the book of Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 and verse 2. Ready, go. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Verse 2. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. At that time, God promised his blessing to Abram. Therefore, Abram decided to obey God's calling. Therefore, he decided to leave his country in order to obey God's calling. Likewise, Abram also became a blessed one when he decided to thirst and trust God. In the same way, God will also bless our lives. However, God first wants us to thirst for him first. Therefore, let us continue to thirst for God in our circumstance. Especially, Jesus also mentioned blessing. So finally, let us read the book of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 7. Ready, go. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. Likewise, Jesus encouraged believers to continue to ask, seek, and knock to receive God's blessing. In other words, he will answer all the believer prayers when they thirst in the name of Jesus. In the same way, we should continue to seek, ask, and knock on God. Therefore, I want to ask one final question for everyone. Are you ready to thirst for God once again? Yes. Thirst for God, trust in God's power. We are blessed. Ask, seek, and knock on God. Can we do it together? Thirst for God, trust in God's power. We are blessed. Ask, seek, and knock on God.